Hi, I am Preeti. I'm one of the students in the Sound Mind Psychedelic Facilitator training program. And one of the things I know as the founder of the Asian Psychedelic Collective is that Asians are the fastest growing ethno-racial group in the United States. And they're also the fastest growing ethno-racial group in Oregon, where over 275,000 people identify as Asian American. And that's a 48% increase between 2010 and 2020. Which is, of course, so important for those in the program who are going to be working with psilocybin-assisted therapy in the only state where it's currently legalized. But the challenge is, despite this growth, there's been a surge of anti-Asian violence within the state that, according to the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission, shows that anti-Asian hate crimes have increased by 300%. And that was in 2021. So the great challenge I think we face as potential facilitators or existing facilitators is that there is a lot of trauma that might surface in a psychedelic experience that could be largely unrecognized because it's something that isn't talked about in the public domain and that there's very little representation of in psychology research. And this is why I was so excited to connect with Shin Shin Tang, who wrote this incredible book called Asian American Psychology and Psychotherapy. It's the first book in 13 years to be a general text looking at Asian Americans through a psychology lens. And thank you so much, Shin Shin, for being willing to talk with me and share some of your insights with class today. I'm really grateful for your work in the world and particularly curious about, what I think we now see is this idea or this trend in mental health and even beyond mental health to put all non-white folks under a general BIPOC designation. And I would love to know why it's so important for therapists, coaches, and facilitators to have a more nuanced understanding of people's cultural backgrounds.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for that lovely introduction too, Preeti. And yeah, I think I really like this question because it speaks to one of the main reasons I wrote this book, because all BIPOC are, it may seem obvious, but are not the same. And Asian Americans certainly have different lived experiences than African Americans and Latinx and Native Americans and Pacific Islanders. And as you said, often we are not in the news, we're not talked about, we're not researched. It's really only since the pandemic that there's been more awareness of anti-Asian racism that is not new, but is, as you mentioned, the incredible surge really propelled, unfortunately, this issue for the first time, consistently in the media and in people's awareness. So, and one of the ways that Asian American experiences are different is, for one, we're often seen as foreign and not American. So, like a common microaggression towards Asian Americans is, where are you from? And if you say California, they'll say, where you really from? And you probably experienced this, or you speak great English, when you could be second or third generation or fifth generation, or even an immigrant who's been naturalized, who is American. There's this assumption that we're never really American, not as American as perhaps other communities. And on top of that, I think what kind of rubs salt in that wound is the erasure of that fact that's not recognized as even existing, that because we're thought of as a model minority, as the minority that everyone should aspire to, that does so well, we don't have problems, and including racism or anti-Asian racism. And so that gets scrubbed out with this model minority myth. And so those are some of the reasons why I think it's so important to see Asian Americans as having very different experiences as other BIPOC.
You bring up this model minority myth, which I think people do assume that all Asians are okay, we're successful, we're, hardworking, we're obedient, we're striving without recognizing that, I like to say like that is actually a trauma response. Like this push to work so hard is born out of, at least I'll speak as an immigrant to this country, a family that came here with very little money, that really knew education was a pathway to safety and security, and what we call success, but is what is really just a survival tactic. Is that how you experience that as well?
Absolutely. I think survival and being in survival mode when your family might have fled war, poverty. Um, and then I think layered with that is, um, there's this kind of carrot dangled in front of you. Like you can have, success if you do all these things and work hard and get a good education and stay quiet. And so I think those things really intersect to create this trap, in a sense, of that model minority myth.
And that perfect storm of keeping quiet when we go through any sort of hardship.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the trade-off. Is if you want to be a model minority and have the success that America will offer you, you have to stay quiet.
Yeah. And I think it's internal as well as external, where it's like we also come from a culture where we don't want to bring shame to our family or lose face. So once again, it's like it's not just about the individual, it's about the collective. And like we want you to think we're okay, because we don't, I don't know, I'm speaking very broadly here, but that in some ways it's like this vicious cycle where both internally and externally you can't kind of find that place, that safe space to say I'm not okay, and I need help.
Yeah, I think that's very insightful. And and I also want to caution people who might be watching against, thinking, well, this is how all Asian Americans are. We're all worried about saving face, or we all think we're a model minority. But there is some truth in that. And I think that comes in part from, like you said, in large part from the immigrant culture and from the countries of origin that we and our parents and grandparents may have come from. And so that's brought where the collective good is often put above the individual wants or even needs, that we sacrifice for each other. And there's a beauty in that, and there can be a trauma response in that as well. As you said earlier, sometimes it's survival. And then there's this, in my book, I talk about cultural betrayal trauma, which is this need to further protect your community because there's oppression and discrimination and racism. And so that creates an even more tighter knit bond of trust, that where you need your community, and it would be a betrayal of them to complain about them or to talk about some of the uglier things that can happen within a community.
Yeah, that's what you mentioned there is just like so powerful and palpable. And I also am really compelled by what you shared around like that we're not a monolith, right? We are one of the most diverse communities in the world. 2 out of 3 people on the planet are of Asian descent. So like there's no way we could all be the same. And I found this so such an inspiring and interesting way to start your book, which was with this Perceptions of Asian Americans quiz, and a preamble that was inspired by a request from one of your peer reviewers who invited you, and I'm going to quote here, to explicitly call out the tendencies of many non-Asian readers to overgeneralize, essentialize, and trap all Asians into static, non-changing, incapable of change subjectivities. So like that statement blows me away, because it goes from just being like monolith to something that's so like there's so much, it's just like there's such precision in that language. And then I see here, like in some of the answers, it's like, you know, some of the questions around asking people before they enter into the book, like, hey, what do you know about Asian Americans? Like, what do you think here? And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I hope everyone will. But for example, like, you know, beliefs about Asian American religious practices. 35% of Americans believe Buddhism is the most common religion practiced by Asian Americans, but only 8% of Asian Americans identify as Buddhist. The most common religion is Christianity, or most Americans, 75% say they're familiar with food from Asian countries, right? No surprise there. But significantly fewer are familiar with customs and music/art. Like, can you name any current Asian American musicians, right? And of course, I know a lot of people would be like, no, I cannot. Writers, musicians, you know, artists, like all that stuff starts to fall away. Or, you know, like this one really hit my heart. The status index report, when people were talking about have they felt experiences of discrimination, 80% of Asian Americans, 90% of Black Americans, and 73% of Hispanic/Latinx Americans say they feel discriminated against in the United States. Like, this is what we're going through, but though we may not be speaking to it, you know, and we'll see this like East Asian spike now, but being South Asian, I remember the 9/11 spike, you know, that like this has not gone away. It's getting harder sometimes. It's maybe less hard at other times, but like this exists for us too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Will you tell me, I guess now that I've given that long preamble, like what are the implications for people who will be supporting Asians on their healing journey? Like just by you sort of unlocking from the start, like, hey, you may think X, but we're really Y. Like, what is it, if you had to broadly generalize, what would be the invitation for people who are going to be working with Asian and Asian American populations to consider?
Yeah, thanks for asking. And yeah, you gave away some of the answers.
Or maybe not, but it came from your book.
The one about religion stumps a lot of people. It's a great one. And the quiz was really meant to be an invitation, like you said, like and a fun way, you know, like something that's a little light. It's, you know, you can do it privately. It's meant for a classroom, but something that kind of starts to probe or help people pause before they kind of dive into, you know, we all want to just get into the work. And, you know, whether we're therapists or coaches or facilitators, we just want to, you know, do that. But really, I think before working with any oppressed community, you need to do a little homework, and that homework starts with yourself. And just, you know, questioning maybe some beliefs, or even being aware of some either internalized racism or learned racism that might be there, and you might be surprised to find. And so the quiz was meant to be like this non-shaming way of pointing some of those out to explore, really, with some curiosity and maybe surprise. And then before really kind of diving into the work. And so often in life, I think we don't have time or don't take time to do that. But it's so important to have that foundation and to maybe have some self-awareness. Yeah.
I'm hearing self-awareness, curiosity, and humility.
Humility, especially. Yeah. And it takes some courage, because humility is often not fun. You know, I've experienced it too. We're like, oh shoot, I thought that, you know, we have these parts of ourselves. We like to think of ourselves as non-racist, like, especially if we're in a helping profession. You know, being racist is a really bad word, and something that most people, I think, try to push away or don't identify with. But we do have these parts, unfortunately, just because it's in the water, it's in the air, and we assimilate it, and we see it, you know, in the movies. You can't help it. And so it's understandable that it's there, but what's important is to kind of bring it to light. There's also a little link to what's called the IAT, the It's like a little quiz that helps get at like subconscious beliefs, because you're answering questions really fast and then it gives you a score. And what it shows is that people, like when people kind of get a little stuck on things that counter some internalized biases, it takes a little longer to answer the questions. And so maybe it's a millisecond, but if there's a link to that in that quiz too, in that first introduction, and it takes 10 minutes, people like just scan it in their phone. Try it out. You'd be surprised. There's one on Asian Americans, there's different BIPOC quizzes, there's one on weight, there's one on LGBTQ folks, and it's really revealing and, as you said, humbling.
Yeah, that's a great something great to point to, which I'll make sure to include. And I think it's also when you talk about like it's in the air and in the water, like it's in the medical system. And this was one of my like biggest ahas in your book was like we, you know, one of the intake forms that we rely on is the adverse childhood experiences or ACEs questionnaire. And I think your assessment of it really captures how dramatically Asians are misunderstood, right? So it might not be overt racism, but like they're going to be these blind spots, and how challenges, you know, can go unseen because we simply didn't ask for that or solve for that. So the original ACE studies conducted by the CDC didn't include racism as an adverse event, but the Philadelphia ACE project that updated the ACE survey included questions on racism, bullying, and poverty. And so I'd love just an explanation from you about what ACE reveals about or doesn't reveal about Asians, just so we can start to sort of uplift and highlight, like, again, what we may not realize is missing.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I love that work of the Philadelphia ACE project, because they're really pioneering something that research has shown, that experiences of poverty and racism have a direct impact on mental health and physical health. So it seems intuitive, but this is why representation is so important in research too. When it's not on people's radar, they're not going to think it's important. And so, and so the ACEs the original questionnaire was developed in the late 90s, I think. So it's been a while, and they were querying mostly white middle-aged people who grew up in the 50s and 60s. And so racism wasn't talked about as openly in those circles. So fortunately, there has been some progress there. And regarding ACEs and Asian Americans, if anyone Googles it, and this is what got me on this track, you Google it and you'll find link after link that says it's rare or much lower among Asian Americans than any other ethnic group, including whites, Blacks, Latinx. Like, just, Asians are doing the best of everyone. And I just knew this wasn't true. Not in the research I had done, and not in my lived experience, not among my friend groups, not, if you go on social media, there's all kinds of memes of Asian parenting. It's maybe not so flattering, but it's this open secret. And so this research just really confounded me. And so I dug a little deeper, and I was like, oh no, like there is good research out there. It's just not being talked about, that has found that Asian Americans really, unfortunately, experience an incredibly high rate of ACEs. And so I know you might have, I think in a little note, you wanted me to compare Asians and African Americans and Asians and other ethnic groups, but honestly, that data doesn't really exist so much. Mm-hmm. I like in the book, I reviewed every single ACE study I could find on Asian Americans, and it wasn't that many, maybe 10, 8 to 10 of them. And the CDC itself has never done a single study on ACEs to date that I could find on Asian Americans. More often, we're grouped in with Native Americans and Pacific Islanders in this literally called other. So that's still a huge hole. But there have been, fortunately, some really good epidemiological studies that capture like thousands of responses. And those consistently show, physical abuse is around, I believe, around 60 to 80% of people endorse that, as having experienced that in childhood. Emotional abuse is at equally high rates. And what might be surprising for a lot of people is sexual abuse is also incredibly high. I think it's around 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 10 boys, which sadly mirrors the high rate in the general population. It's not, so to me, these statistics are believable. But I think there is some racism in here in this research that may not be intentional, but it goes along with that erasing of model minority myth, where some certain people did this research and used what I describe as culturally inappropriate research methods. And so they found very low rates of ACEs among Asian Americans, but nobody bothered to look at other studies and do a really quick literature search that, is really easy to do. Nobody questioned that because they thought, oh, yep, is my guess. Like, this fits the model minority myth. So we're not going to bother doing a lit review.
This is it, right? It's a self-perpetuating challenge. And when you say culturally inappropriate research methods, what does that mean?
Well, I mean, one example would be of this particular group I'm thinking of would be to call parents and do a phone survey and ask, one of the questions was something along the lines of, has your child experienced physical punishment or they didn't say abuse, I think, but a lot, that's implied. And of course, any self-respecting Asian mama is going to say nope. I cannot imagine any Asian parent saying yes to that question. Maybe a few did, but so that's what I mean, because this goes back to our talk about what we said earlier about loss of face, about having to have a tight community in the face of white racism and white supremacy, like really needing to protect your own and not necessarily trusting authority. So really the more standard way of doing this is to do anonymous surveys, to ask people about their own experiences, and you'll get much more accurate results that way.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just really taken by everything you shared and so grateful for your work and for naming that othering that also happens, that I think that was what prompted my sort of request, like any data on like comparing us as groups as opposed to it just being black, white, other, which I think, again, like there's just these sprawling sort of assumptions made. And I don't necessarily think they serve any of our populations, because they effectively, again, just serve to erase our lived experience. So yeah, thanks for helping uplift Asians in this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. It's something I care about deeply, and hope that more and more people can just have some more awareness about our really diverse stories.
Right. Wow.